Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 61 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening! With Carl at her back, Janir staggered through the mansion. Her senses were blurring, and she could hardly keep upright. Carl yanked her into corners or behind crates whenever the sound of the enemy came too close. Without him, she would have been caught, but she didn't care at the moment. Brevia was safe for now. Those thousands she'd saved would be protected, but if she couldn't save Saoven, she'd never forgive herself. Finally, she fumbled to Saoven's holding cell. Kicking the door open, she nearly wept. Saoven! His broken ankle remained twisted at a cruel angle, but he visibly relaxed on seeing her. Janir! She crashed to the ground in front of him, carefully fingering the new cuts and wounds from last night. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Is it destroyed? Saoven asked. Yes, it is. Goblin, you look terrible. Carl took in Saoven's injuries with horror. Ruin's body remained where it had fallen, and Janir turned away from it. The memory of killing him left a cold pit in her stomach. Saoven croaked. I feel worse. I expect as much. The enchanter cleared his throat. So, how are we getting out of here? Are there keys somewhere? Janir choked, overflowing with too many emotions to name. No, just these magic sticks. Janir's carcatan remained buckled to the fallen barrel, just as they had been. There was nothing to indicate anyone had been in here since she left. We're kind of on a time crunch. Carl gestured to the west, where the sounds of battle were growing louder. Cradling her cheek, Saoven smoothed his thumb over her skin. I never knew how to say it. There don't seem to be words for this. Janir fought to keep from crying again. He rested his forehead against hers. Te amo, Janir Keir Sanagatalam. There was something final in those words, something resigned and defeated. Shaking her head, Janir clutched his hands. I'll find a way to free you, just give me a... The door swung open. Knistrith halted abruptly over the threshold. With a glance, she took in the situation. Holy! Carl leapt back. You killed Morton Ruin. Knistrith tut-tutted disapprovingly. That was you with the chalice just now, wasn't it? She slid a carcatan from her belt. And your little Brevian friend is an enchanter. Knistrith purred with approval. Do you know all the things I could do to him? Janir was on her feet in an instant, throwing Carl behind her, but she had no idea what she was going to do. Fear nagged at the back of her mind, and the memory of the carcatan's sting was fresher than ever. But they were her only hope. If she could just get to her carcatan, she might stand a chance. Calling them to her would mean a moment of incapacitation, and she couldn't afford that, but maybe... Janir, this is going to be far easier, and it will take much less time if you let me... Charging, Janir grabbed Knistrith's wrist and dug her fingernails into the tendons as hard as she could, while wrenching Knistrith's arm. Knistrith shrieked, more in anger than anything else, and kneed Janir in the ribs before drawing her other carcatan and driving it into Janir's back. Hang on! Carl yelled, screaming through clenched teeth. Janir shoved her weight sideways and body-slammed Knistrith. Saoven shouted something. Janir was still clenching Knistrith's other wrist and digging her fingers deeper and deeper into the tendons as she fought the sting of the carcatan at her back. Knistrith staggered a few steps and then recovered, removing her carcatan from Janir's flesh, only to drive it harder against Janir's neck. Janir let a wordless shriek of pain tear from her mouth, but she fought with everything that was left in her. "Take that!" Carail swung a chain at Knistrith's back, and it hit with a hard thud. Knistrith staggered and whirled around, glowering murder at the enchanter. "Stay away," Janir yelled. "Don't let her touch you." "Like I need to be told?" Carail kept the chain raised, not taking his eyes off the Mortana. Still gripping Knistrith's wrist, Janir grabbed Knistrith's leg just behind the knee. With a swift jerk, she knocked Knistrith off balance and slammed into her again. They both crashed to the floor, Janir weighing down Knistrith's warm, sticky blood running down both their arms. Janir's fingers broke skin and kept sinking deeper into Knistrith's wrist. Jabbing an elbow into Knistrith's gut, Janir grabbed her forearm. Out of the corner of her eye, Janir caught Saoven, watching the door fearfully. If anyone came to help her aunt, they were done for. For a moment, the two Argotolums stayed that way, straining against each other, each one fighting for her life. "Carail, get my carcatan," Janir grunted. "How? Without touching them? Just do it." A vein stood out on Knistrith's forehead as she strained against the girl. "What are you going to do, Janir? Kill your own flesh and blood?" With that, she spat in Janir's face. Janir flinched, and in the same instant, Knistrith drove a carcatan into the middle of Janir's chest, right against her sternum. With the carcatan's wail ringing in her ears, and the bite of the carcatan forcing its way through her veins, Janir wasn't cognizant of Knistrith wrenching her legs free. An instant later, Knistrith slammed both feet against Janir's stomach, sending her across the small room and into the wall. Janir almost welcomed it. Suddenly, she was piled against the wall, free from the burn of Knistrith's carcatan. Still, Knistrith's kick had left her insides feeling pickled, and every inch of her body was sore from some bruise or welt or other. "Get up," Saoven pleaded. "Get up." Knistrith rose, wincing and fussing over her left wrist as it dripped blood. "Impressive," she hissed. "It seems glimpsing the love of your life has put some fight in you." "I'll certainly mention it to your father," she goaded. "Perhaps, after we've finished breaking you both, properly this time, the Lord Argotolum will even let you share a bed." Though her cheeks flushed with humiliation, Janir clung to the spark of anger at those words. Don't even talk about him." Knistrith smirked. Janir scratched her way onto her hands and knees as her body pulsed with aches and dull pangs. She glared up at Knistrith. Her aunt was faster, more experienced, and fresher than her. Janir would inevitably lose, but what could she do besides keep fighting? Janir creaked upright to her feet, keeping a whimper of pain locked behind her teeth. Saoven was at her side, barely able to move. He had suffered so much for her. Her soul had recognized him even when her eyes could not. What kind of bond must this be? "I hate you," Janir snarled at her aunt. "I hope you die, and I won't be sorry." Knistrith cocked her head to the side, unimpressed. "Well, that's one thing we'll have to—" "Carail, stay back!" The enchanter swung the short length of chain, shackles he must have taken from the wall, clipping Knistrith's shoulder. It knocked her off balance, and she staggered. Carail swung a second time, but Knistrith blocked, smashing the fragile wood and seizing Carail by the throat. Carail swung a second time, but Knistrith blocked, seizing Carail by the throat. She slammed him against the wall, forcing him to look into her eyes. "No!" Janir crashed into her aunt, ripping the woman's hand off Carail. The next instant, a carcatan was jabbed against her gut, stinging, biting, burning. Janir thought she screamed, but she wasn't sure. She flattened her palms against Knistrith's chest, braced against the wall. Knistrith attacked mercilessly, grinding her rod against Janir's skin without a scrap of pity. From over her aunt's shoulder, Janir caught sight of her carcatan. She called them to her out of desperation, needing something. She let her need fuel the summons, and the carcatan twitched. Knistrith slammed Janir's head into the wall. Stars speckled her vision, but Janir pulled at her carcatan with all her might. Knistrith jerked with a wet rip. She let out a weak, stunned gasp, and blinked at the 2 black rods sticking out her chest. A shrieking, keening scream echoed off the walls. Saoven and Carl clapped their hands over their ears as Janir grabbed the hilts of her carcatan and ripped them free. Noise, mad noise, burst from just outside the door. Brevian and Argatalam voices intermingled, but Janir stared at her aunt. Knistrith's blood soaked her hands. It had a hot stickiness to it, the kind that made Janir ache to wash it off. Knistrith staggered, touching the gaping wounds with shaking fingers. She pulled them away, stained in black blood. Janir couldn't move. She couldn't speak. The rods in her hands dripped onto the stone. "Oh," Knistrith whimpered. Her shocked eyes met Janir's for the briefest of moments before her knees buckled and she collapsed. There was no shock, no horror, not even the telltale pain Argatalam's experienced at the death of a loved one. Janir couldn't move, and she couldn't think. "Over here!" Carl shouted at the top of his lungs. "We're in here!" Starting, Janir spun around in time to see a Brevian sword swipe for her neck. She ducked, and Carl sprang in front of her. "Oh, no you don't!" The enchanter glared down the Brevian and his 2 comrades as they exploded into the room. Carl pushed her toward Saoven, fearless as a brick. "Janir's a good Argatalam." Before the Brevians could argue, Velasquez was shouldering past. Bow and nocked arrow in hand. He had scuffs on his armor, and 1 temple was bleeding, but he otherwise appeared fine. "Saoven." Barely pausing long enough to survey the room, Velasquez slung his bow over one shoulder and drew a short sword. With a single blow, he severed Saoven's chains from the wall and knelt beside him. "I have you," Velasquez said quietly. "You're safe." Saoven let off a choked sound as Velasquez accidentally touched his bad shoulder, but he took a shuddering breath of relief. Velasquez embraced his son, and Saoven clung to him tightly. For a moment, he reminded Janir of a small boy finding his father after a night lost in the forest. But there wasn't much time. "Doors, Filk, take him." Velasquez stepped aside and motioned 2 of the Brevian soldiers forward. "We have to get him behind our lines." "Saoven." Janir took a step for him, but Velasquez pushed her back, not unkindly. "She's an Argatalam?" said the first guard, still blocked by Carl. "Good thing, too." Velasquez surveyed Ruin and Knistrith's corpses, glancing between the Mortana's gaping wounds and the blood dripping from Janir's carcatan. "She is not our enemy." "Janir." Saoven winced as he stood between the 2 Brevians. His broken ankle hung limply, foot dangling. "She's coming," Velasquez answered, sheathing his sword and surveying her in a single decisive glance. "Mind your carcatan." Janir tore her eyes from Saoven long enough to accept her belt from Carl and sheathed the rods at her hip. Knistrith's blood leached out the holsters, and she grimaced, wishing she'd thought that through. "Come here." Velasquez slung one of her arms over his shoulders. She flinched when he tugged at the raw skin where the shackles had been. He readjusted his grip and scooped her off the ground with surprising ease. Janir gasped, bruises crying out in protest. Velasquez folded her against his chest, stepping over Knistrith's body as he followed the Brevians with Saoven. "I'll just come to then, eh?" Carl trailed close on Velasquez's heels, watching Janir. "You okay?" "Everything hurts. You?" Carl shrugged. letting off a nervous chuckle. Well, I thought I was done for when she got her hands around my throat. Terrifying. But I'm all right. Good. Janir let off a slow exhale, exhaustion setting in. Ahead, at least a dozen more Brevians came barreling toward them, naked weapons in hand. Janir flinched, fingers digging into Velasquez's shoulders. It's all right, girl, he said lowly, not looking from the path ahead. You're under my protection now. The Brevians charged past, shouting. They paid no heed to Janir, or the small quad led by the elf. The noise of battle raged on in the distance, and Janir's temple throbbed in time to the tramp of their boots. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.